Thank you, Anne and Pamela. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to ask you one question, and then we're going to get people from the audience to also ask whatever they want. Well, I would love to talk about this for a long time. I just wanted to bring something we haven't probably mentioned on each of the talks and get your point of view. In your case is antibiotics and the crisis we're facing. Your case is bees. How worried should we be about, what all the news that are being published about the vanishing of bees and how important they are for crops and what we can do from the genetics point of view to recover from that problem? Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I will start. Antibiotics, well, as the topic was next generation of humans. I didn't feel that I had to talk about the antibiotics, but of course one of the main topic in medicine and biomedicine today is the crisis of the antibiotics, where there is such a resistance in many places and many species, and how to correct that using technologies is of course one of the elements that can be developed. But I think it goes with a lot of public policies and health policies about how to manage in a good way antibiotics treatment in order not to spread the resistant germs. Yeah.
But can we do anything from the technology perspective and the genetics perspective?
You can engineer a number of bacteria, or in order to resist, not to resist, or to modify on the level of the genes the resistance to the antibiotics. But that's not what will solve the big crisis, I would say, at the first thing. But there are possibilities, yes.
Mela.
Bees. I'm a plant biologist, but I'll talk about bees. So rice is self-pollinating. No bees are needed because the self-pollinating means that the pollen doesn't need to be transferred. But I live in California. We have half of all the fruits, nuts, and vegetables are produced in the Central Valley where I live for the entire nation of the United States. And we have an enormous almond industry which is highly reliant on bees. We actually don't use native bee pollinators. Our bees are from Europe. And the beekeepers travel around. They go to different pollinations. So our pollination is in February. We have a very early spring. And there's a lot of very serious issues with bees in terms of disease outbreaks in bees. So there are bee geneticists that are trying to work on this problem. How's that for an answer?
I was trying to get to the point where if you think that by altering the genetics of plants, we're going to be less dependent on fertilizers, for example, or we're going to be able to avoid other problems that you're having. Bees was just an example. I was also thinking about drought, for example, in California. You had the opposite of floods. You've been having serious problems with droughts. I was wondering if you also were working in that direction.
Yeah, we are, and many other scientists are also working on drought. So the idea is to try to develop crops that can withstand very difficult times in the climate. And so maybe I should mention just about genetics. Of course, ever since we've had agriculture, we've had some type of genetics. And the reason is there's always been challenges for farming, whether you're an organic farmer or another farmer, there's always challenges. You have pests, disease, you have floods, you have droughts. And so farming is a dynamic system. So there's always need for change and improvement.
A couple of people in the audience, anyone who has a question? Over there. We have time for two.
I just wanted to ask, both of you have shown us specific ideas for resolution for specific problems, but in the context globally, politically, of how these solutions can be implemented, what is how can you educate the politicians, the deciders, and all of those people, so that they are as progressive as your propositions?
Well, I think it's a difficult question how to educate the policymakers. I think that we need scientists to really explain things, not only to our peers, but also to policymakers. We need not to try to convince them in one orientation, but to expose the evidence. And you said we build on evidence. And the issue is how to build evidence-based policies and not just belief or on ground. The more we will have policies based on evidence, the more realistic they will be. And this is not always in the mind of policymakers, but I would say more and more. And one of the things that is of this big forum I was talking about at the end of my talk is that there will be policymakers, scientists, and this kind of debate and how to use science and science advice in policy making is really one of the pillars of such a conference. So I hope at least this will be one step forward.
Anything to add?
Oh, that's a great answer. I think as scientists, we're always trying to remind policymakers, well, and consumers too, that you don't get to pick and choose your science. And there's always been and continues to be this idea that sort of a rejection of science is if it doesn't fit one's preconceived belief. And so we're really trying to fight against that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else over here? We may need another mic.
When to. Thank you. Pamela, I think you will make an amazing case for your research, and we clearly see the beginning where it comes from, the need of people in the field, and how you tie to your research, your everyday activities. It's quite amazing to see that link. As a former researcher, I really appreciate that. I hear also the case for talking to policymakers with fact-based, evidence-based research, which is really impactful. I think there's also one piece missing from that puzzle. I worry about the logistics of bringing the product of your research to the people. The chain, the supply chain, and the logistics involved are mostly owned by corporate entities, by companies, commercial entities that are fueled by private equity or publicly traded companies. And they own all the channels to basically bring into the hands of farmers, for example, everything that they need to grow stuff. I mean, it could be seeds, it could be material, it could be agricultural engine, it could be all these things. How do we onboard them into the dialogue that you are building? What impact, what questions, what are the mechanisms that we have to set up so that they are onboarded in that adventure?
So I think when it comes to farming, it's important to keep in mind that there's different types of farming economies. So in Europe, in the United States, most farmers buy their seed from major corporations. It doesn't matter if it's genetically engineered or genetically improved using some other method. These are for-profit companies that are selling seed to farmers, just like you would buy your iPhone from Apple Computer. All of the companies are obviously much smaller than Apple, but it's completely different in the less developed world. So all those projects that I talked about are in the public domain. They're freely distributed. They were funded by nonprofit agencies. And if you're a Bangladeshi or Indian farmer, you will get your seed, you pay some small fee to get your seed from a national organization, and then you self-pollinate and regrow your seed. So I know there's a lot of concern about seed companies, and obviously there's a lot of discussion about, well, do we want only 3 or 4 major seed companies, which is worth talking about. But it's not an issue for the projects that I talked about. So I think one thing that gets confused in the public debate is this idea that modern genetics is corporations. Well, seed companies in the developed world are selling seed to farmers who are their consumers, but it doesn't have to do with modern genetics or old genetics. So I hope that helps. But all those projects, public domain, freely distributed to growers, the eggplant, the rice, they can all reproduce their own seed. They don't go back to the seed company every year. And maybe just briefly, the seed companies in the 1920s produced hybrids. That's the reason farmers go back to the seed companies. It doesn't have to do with genetic engineering so much. It's hybridization, which is a different type of genetic technique.
If I can just add one word, I think that one of the key, and of course I don't have the solutions, is this debate I was talking about. There are methods for engineering debates, and getting, I would say, people, citizens, not specifically actors in a given domain, participating, is probably one of the key, because politicians and companies cannot ignore what people think, and if the dialogue is not just an opposition where no conversation can happen. So I would say that these things that I showed on some of the slides, debate with the public, involve different kinds of people, is probably something which is very important both for policymakers and companies, and that scientists should facilitate and do not hesitate to engage in.
Okay, I think we have no more time for questions, but if you stick around for lunch, you will be able to talk to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.